Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to another episode of Dispatches. I'm your host, Brady Kreitzer. Our guest today is Richard Lim, and he'll be discussing his new book, Refusing a Crown: How George Washington Changed the World. Richard, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Good to be on.
Richard, you're a first-time guest. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, well, I'm sure you'll find my story a familiar one. I was that kid who always had a random history fact for his friends, the history geek in the group. I started getting obsessed with American history and presidents at age 8, and, memorized all the presidents by, fourth grade. My mom would take me to the local library and I would just devour books on presidents and eventually I just love history, period. And about 9 years ago, I was in a job that I didn't love. And I had a lot of friends that were saying, oh, you should start a podcast. And so I did about 9 years ago, the podcast, This American President. And yeah, that's how I got into podcasting and I have my own podcast that you're on as well. So that's kind of basically the whole breakdown. I've worked in DC for many years. I originally am from California. DC, when I first moved there, I was like a kid in a candy shop, seeing all the museums and seeing the monuments and the original documents. It was incredible to be there, lived there for many years, eventually moved back from there. I'm still that kid who loves history. It's like every pilot is a kid that, falls in love with airplanes and builds airplane models and everything like that. I think it's, ultimately every history geek is a kid that just got obsessed with history at some point.
Excellent. So, Richard, we have a lot of readers who are also writers. I myself am a writer. I love talking to writers about their process. Tell us about this book. How did you get the inspiration for it? Tell us about how it came about.
Yeah, so it actually starts almost 20 years ago when I was on a family trip. It was a family reunion. It was with my stepdad's family in China. And I was getting to know different relatives, some of whom were from China. They had never lived anywhere else. And one relative in particular was talking about politics. And at the time, George W. Bush was the president, and he was critiquing the whole Iraq war. It was obviously not a popular thing throughout the world, and he was critiquing American foreign policy. And I found it interesting to just get his perspective. I was, wanted to listen more than debate or argue or anything like that. But then the conversation veered into history, and he talked about how much he loved history. And he didn't speak any English. I don't speak any Mandarin. It was actually my dad translating. And he said that the American that he admired the most was George Washington. And that really struck me because here's a guy who lives 200 plus years later in a completely different culture. But there was something about George Washington that stood out. And the reason was because Washington gave up power. And that's no secret. We hear about it all the time whenever people talk about Washington. In the great musical, the very popular musical Hamilton, there's songs written about Washington giving up power. But I found that there wasn't a lot written about not just Washington giving up power, but the meaning of it, the significance of it. There's this idea that Washington gave up a crown. The title of my book is Refusing a Crown. And there is this sense that he could have had all this power, he gave it up, and there's a lot of truth to that, but there's also a lot of mythology behind it. And I found that the really interesting story is not just Washington giving up a crown, so to speak, but America really renouncing monarchy, which was basically the universal system of government at the time, especially for large countries. Giving it up and rejecting a crown, not just for itself, but rejecting it in a universal sense, rejecting it as any kind of legitimate political system. America is famous for that, for rejecting monarchy. The story is fascinating, and I wanted to go into what monarchy Washington, quote unquote, rejected and what monarchy America rejected. What did that mean? And also, the story wasn't a clean cut story. Not everyone felt that monarchy was the problem per se, and some actually started feeling, well, once America rejected monarchy, some wanted us to go back to one. So that whole story is a lot more complicated and interesting than I think people have realized.
Yeah. So, Richard, take us back. Washington, for most of his life, is a loyal imperialist. He's a loyal Briton. God save the king, all those kind of things. What do we know about his views of monarchy pre-revolution? Because he lays his life on the line in the French and Indian War for the crown. So, what can we say about his understanding of monarchy and power early in life?
Well, it's one of those things that it's such an accepted notion, the idea of a monarch governing an empire, that it's almost like a fool's errand to try to find anything that's where George Washington says, "I believe in monarchy," because that was the accepted system of government. It was ubiquitous. It was part of the air that they breathed. It was just a given. And I would say that, Washington, he bought into this idea that monarchs had a very important role to play in governance, even in societies that were enlightened and even in societies that valued a measure of freedom. By then there was this centuries-long struggle between the British, the monarch and the aristocracy. And, that had resulted in the creation of Parliament. And so Parliament was there to represent the people. But the monarch was there, he ruled by divine right. And so divine right was something that, it was kind of like the accepted philosophy. But things had evolved by then, because at that point there was this notion that while Parliament, played a role as the representatives of the people in a sense, the monarch had, this symbolic role as kind of the anchor of stability in the entire realm. And part of that stability was to check the factions in the parliament. One of the drawbacks of parliament was that they represented factions rather than the whole people. They were susceptible to, the ugly battles, the interscene warfare that would develop, in which, the majority factions would try to trample over the rights of the minority factions. And the monarch played the role checking those factions. And the idea was that because the monarch represented the whole realm, his welfare was tied into the welfare of the entire kingdom. And, there are actual quotes of the founders saying that an unchecked parliament is more dangerous than an unchecked monarch, because an unchecked parliament had an incentive, and it had the legitimacy of representing the people, which would allow it to essentially become the tyranny of the majority. I talk in my book about how back during the founding, ancient Rome was the model because it was a republic over ancient Greece, which was a democracy, because to the founders, democracy would just devolve into tyranny of the majority, and it had the added legitimacy of representing the people, which would allow it to tyrannize the minority. And so I would say that the monarch played an important checking power on that, and Washington was part of that. In fact, his ancestors during the English Civil War, where you had the Cromwell's revolutionaries versus the Cavaliers, the Royalists. His ancestors actually supported the crown in that battle, and I would say Washington accepted that lineage. So for him, monarchy meant a very specific thing. It wasn't the bad word yet that we see today.
Richard, in your research, did you find a moment in Washington's life where you can see him turn or sour on the notion of monarchy, or is it a slow process?
Well, I would say it was a slow process. The revolution itself was a long process. As you write in your book, you talk about the importance of the Proclamation of 1763, which really, in many ways, was the start of the American Revolution. And you don't get independence being declared until many, many petitions and protests later, 13 years later in 1776. 14 years later. Wait, I can't do my maths. 13 years later, 1776. And so, for Washington and the founders, so much of the revolution was wanting to show that they were not overthrowing government as an institution. They believed that government was, a good instrument given by God to enforce justice throughout the land. They were overthrowing a very specific regime. If you look in the run-up to the revolution, so many of the complaints about tyranny from the founders were against Parliament, not against the king. And part of that is a pragmatic thing because, if you want to go against the king, you're essentially, it's a very, slippery slope to treason. So the fiction that they accepted was that we are loyal to the king, it's his ministers and it's Parliament who are abusing us. And so they're constantly complaining. If you look at the letters, they're saying, Parliament is, has no right to tax me without my consent. It's Parliament that's doing this. But there's always an implicit criticism there because it was the monarch's role to protect them from the whims of Parliament and from the factions of Parliament. And they would call on the king to take up his royal prerogatives and to act and to protect us and to fulfill that role the same way a lord in feudalism would protect his knights. And I'm not saying that they were feudalists, but there was kind of that tradition, that element there. And as it became clear that the king was not doing that, the founders, of the country, the revolutionaries, saw more and more that the problem ultimately was the king because he was the one that was accountable. And the person that gave great voice to that was Thomas Paine in his book Common Sense, where he directly attributed America's ills to the fact that the king was the head of an institution that was inherently tyrannical. And he used an argument there. He actually went into scripture and said that, in 1 Samuel, where God warns the Israelites, if you impose a king upon yourself, he will impose a tyranny on you. And he really synthesized all these views into this idea that monarchy was inherently a corrupt system. And Washington, I believe, bought into that argument.
Well, Richard, let's talk about Washington's decision to step away, to give up power after the revolution. Was that expected? The reactions we get to that are just phenomenal. The new Cincinnatus, it becomes a defining moment in his life. Did people anticipate that? And why do you think the reaction was so strong afterwards?
Yeah, it's interesting because there's a great painting in the Capitol building, and it's by John Trumbull, the same artist who did the Declaration of Independence, the iconic painting. And this painting is George Washington resigning his commission. And that painting to me is the defining image. It is of Washington resigning his commission, but there's so much symbolism there about what Washington did in the lead up to that. And the lead up to that was basically 8 years of war in which George Washington had to fight a war differently than virtually every commander in world history. He had to fight a war while respecting the constraints of civilian authority. And that was very difficult because he essentially had to deal with the pitfalls of basically a people that hadn't fully decided what it meant to have a republic. They were creating something that was brand new, and they hadn't really worked out, what does a republic look like? Does a republic have a central government? Wasn't a central government the problem in the first place? The central government in London that was governing us without our consent. And the result was this system in which he really had 14 civilian masters. He had the national government, Congress, which had its own problems, didn't have enough, authority to really support the army at all. And then he had the 13 states that he had to answer to, and all of them were kind of doing their own thing and not really wanting to bear the burden of the war. And the fact that he was able to run that war and win that war while respecting civilian authority, when so much of civilian authority was actually hampering the war effort, is an incredible historical achievement. So for me, Washington giving up power isn't just about that one moment. It's about everything he had to do up until that point. The suffering of his soldiers, the idea of a Republican government at the time, the philosophy behind it argued that you didn't pay your soldiers. The best soldiers were Republican soldiers, little r Republican, that didn't fight for money, but they fought for their land. They fought for their people. That whole theory completely collapsed because the people who were supposed to fight for their land didn't fight. They would often find substitutes to fight. The actual people that did fight were the poor, and they were desperate for money, but the United States didn't raise the money in taxes to pay them. And so they were constantly, they fought in order to advance their own individual station, but they weren't paid. So they were, essentially destitute, and they threatened mutiny many times. Washington had to toe the fine line because the same people, Congress, that weren't paying the army were the people that Washington had to respect their authority. And as a result, a lot of his own soldiers felt, hey, you're choosing Congress over us. We're the ones that are actually fighting and dying. A lot of these soldiers were very bitter towards the whole country. And so this is all part and parcel of Washington leaving power. Now, was it expected Washington would leave power? According to Republican theory, yes, because George Washington was a citizen, and his authority came from Congress. His authority came from the people's representatives. The most Republican thing you could do would be to lead the nation to victory and then step down, just like Cincinnatus. But as we know from history, there were all sorts of leaders that fudged doing the right thing. Look at Caesar Augustus. Caesar Augustus was arguably the greatest emperor of Rome, but he called himself the first citizen of Rome. So he maintained this fiction that I'm acting as a citizen, ruling, exercising authority. Well, in reality, he was the absolute dictator. That's not a knock on him. That's just the reality of it. Look at Oliver Cromwell, who was the Lord Protector, who refused to crown himself, but in reality had monarchical power. And he essentially had a ceremony where he was all but coronated. So there was still this sense of, especially in Europe, oh, they say the Republic. Oh, that's great. But will Washington fudge it? And he didn't fudge it, which I think makes it even more remarkable.
Well, you mentioned that great painting, and there will be many more like that. Do you think Washington, in his own writings, viewed this as this mythologized, lionized moment? What did he write about retirement? Did he just want to be done?
Well, the thing about Washington, he really knew how to pose for history. And I talk about the play Cato, which, as you're a George Washington scholar, that's his favorite play. He had it performed when he was commander of the Continental Army, and he knew he loved that play. And if you read it, it's a fascinating read, by the way, and it's not quite what I expected. There's actually a bit more of a kind of a sappy romance in the whole story, more than I thought that there would be. There's a little bit of a Romeo and Juliet element to it. It's not just cool, Roman statesmen going at it, but when you read the play, you actually start noticing a lot of things that Washington said and did that literally mimic Cato in that play. And in fact, there's a line in it that sounds very similar to George Washington's last words, "'Tis well." And so I think Washington understood the importance of symbolism. He understood the importance of history's verdict. And he also, he was famously enigmatic. Anyone who studies Washington knows that there's this element of he knew how to craft an image. And I don't want to say that in any way that kind of breeds cynicism. We live in a cynical world where a lot of people just kind of assume selfish motives. I don't think Washington had selfish ambition. I think in his youth he may have had selfish ambition. He was brash, a brash upstart. He, as we know, in the French and Indian War, he got himself involved in some events that he was a bit in over his head and helped provoke the start of the French and Indian War. I think by the time you have the American Revolution, Washington genuinely cares about things like duty and virtue, and he wants to model good virtue. And part of that is to show no ambition. And I think Washington understood the difference between selfish ambition and virtuous ambition. And I think he wanted to show virtuous ambition. And so he's very careful about what he says. And he wants to show that his motives are pure. He talks about how the searcher of hearts, he's talking about God, knows that I have no ambition more than to be a citizen of a good country and to be a farmer back on my estate. And I think he's genuine in that. I think he and he carefully cultivates that. So whenever he talks about giving up power, he talks about it within that vein. He wants to uphold this notion of virtuous ambition because he wants a country that is virtuous.
Richard, this is a big question. You addressed it very well in your book. Did he want to be president?
Oh, he hated the idea of being president. And part of it was out of his own self-interest, because when he gives up power in 1783, and you've said this before, he is the most famous man in the world, but probably the most admired man in the world. So from that moment on, any re-entrance into public life can only be downhill. There's no other place for him to go. And so when he gets invited to the Constitutional Convention in that happens in 1787, he agonizes over the decision, because part of it is, okay, if this thing fails, this is going to mar my reputation. This is going to mar my pristine public record. Maybe pristine is too strong a word, but it's going to undermine his sky high prestige, right? It's funny. It's kind of like, if you have a suit and it's like perfectly white and you're terrified of getting any dirt on it. I mean, I think that's only human nature, right? And so he agonizes over it. He doesn't want people to think that he's going back on his promise to leave power. But as one historian, Bruce Chadwick, said, when it comes time to serve as president, people go to Washington and essentially they say to him, it isn't that you should become president, it's that you must become president. You have to do this. And it's only after Washington is convinced that he's being called to being president, and he won't appear as if he's grasping for the presidency, is when he accepts it. But he talks about the presidency as being like a prisoner going to his execution. And I think as somebody, Washington was not a novice to politics. He had been a member of the Virginian colonial legislature for many years, and he had been a member of the Continental Congress for many years. And he knew that politics was a nasty business, and he knew that decisions were eventually going to disappoint people. People were going to love his decisions and people were going to hate his decisions. It happens with every single president. It happens with our most popular presidents. And so he knew that it would be downhill, but he also knew that he had to do it. He was the only figure that could unite the country. And I think he had a great trust in the destiny of the country. He talks so much about providence. There's so many instances during the American Revolution where essentially the Americans should have lost or been defeated. And somehow, so many times they would make it through, and he would credit the victory to divine providence. And he's quoted saying, no matter what crisis would happen later on, whether it was Shays' Rebellion or anything like that, he would say, I just can't believe that the same providence that has guided us through the previous storms would abandon us now. So I think that's where he got his strength and understood that was worth the sacrifice and the risk to his reputation.
Well, Richard, you alluded to this already. Who will be pressuring Washington to a second term and even into a third term? There, you hear voices saying this is duty, when the man's already served for so long. Who are these voices?
Well, I would say virtually all of his peers. You know, it's one of these remarkable things. And you look at a guy like Patrick Henry. Patrick Henry was an anti-federalist who was on the other side of the argument during the ratification of the Constitution, arguably the most prominent spokesperson of the anti-federalists. He and Washington, they disagreed on the Constitution. Washington felt the nation needed the Constitution. Patrick Henry felt that it would spell doom for the country. Well, Patrick Henry ends up being an elector and voted for George Washington. And even though they disagreed on that, Patrick Henry felt the only guy that can lead us is George Washington. Even though I think he's wrong on this issue, I want him as president of the United States. So that's the kind of leadership that's the kind of prestige Washington had, that even those who disagreed with him knew this man was our guy. He was our leader. He's the only guy we can trust. And so by the time by the time the second election in American history begins, the second presidential election in 1792, as it approaches, his cabinet is already feuding, and they're already, Federalists and Jeffersonian factions in Congress and throughout the country that are just starting to form. It's the kind of the embryo of the American two-party system. And they are already starting to hate each other's guts, and they are already starting to see each other as an existential threat. The Jeffersonians see the Hamiltonians as the party of neo-monarchy in America, and Hamilton sees Jefferson and Madison as the party of anarchy and godlessness. And, they already look at each other as a threat to the survival of the republic. And yet they all look at Washington as the only guy that is preventing the other side from taking over and destroying everything. So I would say at that point, it's everybody. And if you look even at, let's say, articles in newspapers at the time, they're already saying, even Jeffersonian writers are saying, well, thank God we have Washington to check the worst excesses of Hamilton. And the Hamiltonians are saying, thank God we have Washington to check the excesses of the Jeffersonians. And, it's remarkable that even though Washington had already started making decisions that different factions had disapproved of by then, he had signed Hamilton's Assumption Bill in his first term. He had signed Hamilton's National Bank Bill. He was still unanimously elected in 1792. His two elections, the only unanimous elections. And so it shows literally the whole country still felt that it needed Washington.
So when we do see him finally leave power after his second term, all throughout history, he becomes the new benchmark for leadership. And we've seen time and again, as you've mentioned, world leaders make a promise of a limited or curtailed power and then extend it a little more and a little more and a little more until they become dictators. What are some examples that you found in human history where people measure their, we'll say, failed leaders up against Washington? Right? Washington stepped down, these people continued to kick the can down the road and stay in power.
It was in any revolution, I think you could probably find some element you looking back at George Washington. You can talk about Napoleon, whose career rose just as Washington was leaving the stage. He becomes first consul in 1799, the year George Washington dies. And already people are starting to say, hey, you're taking dictatorial power. You were supposed to be the one to consummate the French Revolution. What are you doing? Washington didn't do that. In South America, when Simón Bolívar took dictatorial power, people would accuse him of being a monarch and said, well, Washington didn't do that. Why are you? And both of those men, them or their peers, would try to argue back and say, well, look, Washington was great and all, but, as the Emperor of France, I, Napoleon, have to deal with all these threats. America has two oceans around it. They don't have to deal with these threats. I do. All the monarchies are trying to, destroy the French Republic, and I have to take dictatorial power. And he actually tried to make that counter argument. And one of Simón Bolívar's friends said, look, Washington had the advantage of being in a country that had republicanism built in and had all these peers, Adams and Franklin and Jefferson and Madison, who were little r Republicans. And that's not the same here. So some people would try to make the counter argument. And in my book, I talk about that. And that's not in a way to criticize Napoleon or Bolivar. It is true. There is truth to this idea that they were in different circumstances, different contexts, which I think the proper response then is to consider all of these leaders within their own context. Because even when you study Washington within a Republican context, his conduct still shines in a way that very few other leaders do in their own contexts. But the point is well taken. Maybe Napoleon does have a point that, different circumstances call for different things. I think that's an open debate. There's this actual famous quote where Napoleon is he's in exile, and he supposedly mutters, "They wanted me to be another Washington." And it's often been portrayed as Napoleon lamenting his own inability to live up to Washington's standards. Well, if you actually read the whole source, that's not his tone at all. He's actually saying they wanted me to be another Washington, but if they were in my shoes, they would realize that I could not be another Washington because of the circumstances. And again, he has a point. The French didn't have the same type of self-government the Americans did. It was a very different circumstance. You have to judge Napoleon in his own context. But with that said, the broader point I try to make is that Washington, his character was so admired that he became a standard that all of these guys had to deal with. Going into China, a completely different culture, in 1911, when they had their revolution, Yuan Shikai, the military strongman, ended up taking power, crowning himself emperor. And the revolutionaries then said, hey, you need to be like a George Washington, which I think it shows the power that his example has. And I think Americans don't realize that power. They don't realize that 200 years later, a guy in another country who might not even like America very much, who might say, oh, America's screwing things up and it's doing all these terrible things, can still marvel at George Washington. And part of the reason I wrote my book is that we Americans can rediscover how powerful that story is.
Okay, Richard, we always end with this question. Every episode we've had over 300 episodes of Dispatches. I think it gets to the heart of what we do as historians. How do you think your research, this book, helps us understand the Revolutionary and founding era better?
Yeah, well, it's one of those things that when you look at it's so interesting. I love American history. It's my first love. I've studied a lot of other countries' histories as well. And when you look at America's founding, it appears deceptively linear. You look at it and you go from, Americans, the colonists settle America. And then, they're living their lives all happy. And then suddenly Britain starts taxing it. They have a rebellion. They throw some tea. They declare independence. They win the war. They write a constitution. They have a president. Everyone lived happily ever after. And it's so linear. It's so neat, especially compared to other countries. And since then, we've had this incredible record, of stable elections. We've never really had any fear of, military overthrowing civilian leadership. We always take civilian leadership for granted. It's just a given. But when you actually study the founding, so much had to happen for all of that for all of that to have worked out. And in so many moments, it might not have worked out. I cover the Newburgh Rebellion, in which the U.S. military, the officers, came very close to disobeying Congress. And as a West Point historian, Matthew Motton points out, once that trust is shattered, it can't ever be completely, restored. And so in my book, I try to talk about, hey, this wasn't inevitable. It wasn't as if everything was a given. At the time, things could have gone the wayside, and people at that time knew the stakes, and they knew that had Washington been a different kind of man, had he been willing to fudge it, because in American history, even though we have this republic, even though we have kind of what appears to be this linear progression. There have been a lot of leaders that have fudged it. And when you give even anybody a little bit of power, it's human nature. Even at the local level, there have been lots of party bosses that have been given a little bit of power and they've abused it. Well, Washington had, immense amounts of power at the highest level, and he refused to abuse it each time. And I think, you realize that all those choices mattered. All those choices mattered that resulted in Washington resigning his commission and later leaving the presidency. And I think that it's important for us Americans to know that none of this was inevitable. And it took great leadership, and it took people that were willing to do the right thing and go against the tide of history to give us the republic that we have today.
The new book is called Refusing a Crown: How George Washington Changed the World. Richard Lim, thank you again.
Thank you for having me.